Meccano, part number 59. Collar with grub screw. Hi folks and welcome back. The tank builds of this set have been a lot of fun, and along with the half track have left me pondering ideas of what I can build. But this build had me questioning what it was, because it's not a heavy tank, or is it? But whatever it is, it was very satisfying when finished and worked very well alongside the Airfix toy soldiers. And that is what this build is for. It's a toy to use alongside existing toy soldiers to add an element of play into a game. But Meccano was also there to help teach self-esteem for young people. Now, that might seem a strange thing to want to teach, but by completing a task, in this case making the tank and getting it to work, you release chemicals into your brain. Those chemicals help us to achieve the next challenge, and from that we go on to the next thing, and through time we learn to have faith in ourselves. The lack of reinforcement can have the opposite effect on somebody who is always knocked down. This happened to me. My siblings always coped better at school, and I didn't, leading to being compared and told I was a failure. It wasn't until my late 40s that I heard my father say to me that he was proud of me and loved me. And to the young child in me, that had a profound effect. The low self-esteem and lack of confidence was noted in a report that was compiled about me as to why I was underachieving at school when I was 14 or so. The very pronounced speech impediment was also noted. A lot of this was solved when one event happened to me in my life, that of becoming a dad. In my daughter, I had the one person who had faith in me, total, all-consuming belief that Dad could and would fix it. And for the last 20 plus years, she has both worked on my low self-esteem and helped me to see some value in the person who saw none in themselves, who only saw a worthless failure. And with things like Meccano, you can overcome that feeling of failure that most of us go through. I think the hobby is a perfect parent-child project toy. Let's start with the simple things and work on to the harder things that require more work. But look at the models and dream of what we're going to build next. So let's explore some of the history behind the heavy tank. For the record, I think this is an assault gun, and I believe the source is the Su-100, a late Second World War Soviet tank destroyer. The term heavy tank does not refer to a tank that needs to cut down on their carbs and get some more exercise. The obese, belly hanging out, beer-swilling loudmouth in the corner of the pub that just wants to fight, but is too slow to swing a punch and ends up like a turtle on their back, unable to move. The concept of the heavy tank came out of the stalemate of the First World War and was not a German invention. The intended role was that of a tank capable of ruling a battlefield, unable to be knocked out by lighter tanks, by becoming a mobile strong point, a defensive position that could be moved as the battle's pace changed and tactical situations came and went in the new, fluid, modern battlefield. The Germans foresaw this with their blitzkrieg doctrine, as well as did the Soviets with their combined arms deep operations theory. The British in the 1920s and 30s also tried the tactics with the experimental mechanised force, and threw the findings of the experiments out of the window along with tank design in general. So who were the inventors of the heavy tank? The first giant to roll out across battlefields and dominate the conflict as the new god of war, a veritable Thanos of battle. It was the French, with the Char 2C, or the Char d'Assault de Grand Modèle. The super heavy tank, also called a landship, was 69 tons, 10 metres long, with an impressive 45mm of flat armour and armed with a Cannon D75 Modèle 1897, which was a very good field gun, and 8 machine guns. It was requested in the summer of 1916 when the French shipyard FCM was approached by General Leon Augustin Jean-Marie Murat, the Sub-Secretary for Artillery, and with nothing more than a verbal agreement granted FCM the contract and a lot of money. 1916 was a bad year. The losses of the Somme offensive could no longer be hidden. And in truth, the Allies came very close to losing the war. Civil unrest was growing, and the tank was the new wonder weapon. And in Britain and France, designs were being put forward. My great-uncle, John Godfrey Parry Thomas, who was the chief designer for Leyland, spent his war working for the MOD on gearbox and transmissions on something heavy. Wonder what that was. In France, under the Third Republic, things were done differently. A lot of very lucrative deals were done on nothing more than a handshake. But there did have to be a requirement laid out on paper, a sort of checklist on what you were meant to do and by when. And even if these designs never went into production, there was a lot of money passing hands. And companies were lobbying and courting officials and high-ranking officers to get these deals. Call me a cynic, but I wonder how much corruption was going on there. In late September 1916, General Murat was getting a bit twitchy. After all, FCM had taken the money, but he hadn't heard anything back from them. And as the French army hadn't requested a super heavy tank, and at the time politicians hadn't agreed on the idea, and the French MOD hadn't put the request forward for a test model, we could only presume that General Murat, being the military genius he was in foreseeing the future need of a 70-ton monster to rule the battlefield, and had taken the money without permission and given it to FCM without anybody else knowing. Hold on, isn't that called fraud? Anyway, he was starting to get very worried and visited the yard in Toulon, only to find out that FCM had done nothing with the request apart from spend the money on other things. Hold on, isn't that also called fraud? In a panic, the general went to Louis Renault and begged him to assist FCM in making a prototype at least. Nothing like trying to save your own skin, bearing in mind that the French still used the guillotine, only banning capital punishment in 1981. But storm clouds were brewing. On the 7th of October, Albert Thomas, the Minister of Armaments for the French government, had requested that Lord George, the Prime Minister of Britain, deliver some Mark I tanks to the French for testing. And by the 23rd of January 1917, no such tanks had appeared, or had there been any offer of tanks. He began to get the suspicion that the Brits were silently sticking their two fingers up at the French. Again. So he promptly demanded that French tank production stepped up a pace and specified that he wanted a tank of around 40 tons, with the ability to withstand light artillery rounds with no damage, and be able to cross trenches of up to 3.5 metres. OK, the prototype was 69 tons. 45mm armour was very good for the time, and 10 metres in length will cross a trench of around 4 metres with ease. But Louis Renault wasn't one to be caught out. Why should he give his ideas and money to FCM and save some poor general who should have come to him in the first place? What followed can best be described as a disaster. Somehow, word got out about the tank, probably because Louis Renault told the people who would be opposed to the idea. Because in the ensuing political battle, General Murat, wanting to save his name and possibly his neck, was opposed to the further manufacture of the Renault FT light tank, probably one of the best tank designs to come out of the war, and instead focus on his design. Brigadier Jean Estienne, the commander of the newly formed tank force, knew this would be a disaster, as the FT was perfect for what was needed at the time. Moet had backing from Albert Thomas, who'd been sold on the super heavy tank theory. Because Thomas had publicly backed the design, there needed to be at least a test model, the FCM-1A, and it was huge. Armed with a 105mm Canon D105 Court Schneider with a whopping magazine of 122 rounds. It was able to cross mock trenches in the test, drive through trees up to 28 centimetres thick, climb into and out of deep shell holes. But there were problems. Steering was one, due to the extreme track length. Even though it never threw a track in the test, the machine was difficult to control. It struggled to climb slopes over 65 degrees, and the petrol-powered aeroplane engine was prone to overheating. Overheated engine, petrol fumes, confined space, lots of ammunition. What could possibly go wrong? In the end, the political battle with the powers that be meant that the Shah II would never see combat in the First World War. During the 1920s and 1930s, 10 tanks were produced of the more modern Shah II-C with a crew of 12. But by the time the Second World War started, they were hopelessly obsolete. Standing at over 4 metres in height, they were easy target for the new high-powered German 88mm anti-tank guns. But in the end, they were mobilised in the defence of France, and on the 12th of June 1940, to stop the tanks falling into enemy hands, the remaining 6 tanks were loaded onto a train to be hurried south. But at Neuve-Château, the line was blocked by a burning fuel train. The tanks were to be disabled, fuel lines cut, and ammunition was detonated to destroy the pride of the French armoured force. Germany claimed the victory, stating that the tanks had been destroyed by dive bombers. The Shah II-C was the first super heavy tank to reach operational status, and maybe if Germany had taken notice of what the French had learnt from it, the Tiger II would never have been built. As the Shah II-C was a difficult tank to operate, more costly than what it returned, and the resources made to manufacture it could have been better spent on smaller, lighter vehicles of better design.